October 27th, 1955. New York City. The New York Times building on West 43rd Street. In his cramped office on the 4th floor, film critic Bosley Crowther sits at his typewriter, smoking a cigarette and reviewing his notes from last night's screening of Rebel Without a Cause. At 50 years old, Crowther is the most powerful film critic in America. His reviews can make or destroy careers, and today he's about to deliver the most devastating critique of James Dean's brief career. Crowther types with deliberate precision. Never have we seen a performer so clearly follow another's style. Mr. Dean appears to be doing a studied imitation of Marlon Brando in this clumsy display. The words that will shatter James Dean's confidence and trigger the psychological breakdown that leads directly to his death on a California highway, just hours after this review hits newsstands. The brutal assessment that strips away James's carefully constructed identity as a unique artist and reduces him to nothing more than a Brando copycat. 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, 24-year-old James Dean sleeps peacefully in his rented house in Sherman Oaks, unaware that his reputation is about to be systematically destroyed by the most influential critic in America. By tomorrow morning, Crowther's review will be reprinted in newspapers across the country. By tomorrow afternoon, James will be speeding toward his death, driven by a desperation that those close to him will later trace directly to this moment of public humiliation. This is the untold story of how a critic's words became a death sentence, and how James Dean's unhealed psychological wounds made him incapable of surviving professional rejection. The story of how 15 years of unprocessed trauma turned a harsh but survivable review into the final blow that convinced James Dean he would never be accepted, never be loved, never be anything more than a pale imitation of someone better. Bosley Crowther was not a cruel man. Born in 1905, he had been reviewing films for the New York Times since 1940, establishing himself as the country's most respected voice on cinema. Crowther prided himself on his sophisticated taste, his literary background, and his ability to recognize authentic artistry. He had championed many young actors over the years, helping launch careers with positive reviews. But he had also developed a particular disdain for what he saw as calculated rebellion, artificial angst, and performers who relied on mannerisms rather than genuine talent. When Crowther entered the screening room at the Times building on October 26, 1955, he carried with him certain expectations about Rebel Without a Cause. He had heard the buzz about James Dean, had seen East of Eden, and had formed an opinion that the young actor was more hype than substance. Crowther was particularly suspicious of the comparisons being made between Dean and Marlon Brando, whom Crowther genuinely admired as a revolutionary talent. As Crowther watched Rebel Without a Cause unfold on screen, he saw what he interpreted as shameless mimicry. James's mumbled delivery reminded him of Brando's naturalistic speech patterns. James's physical mannerisms, the way he moved his shoulders, the way he touched his face, the way he seemed to fold in on himself during emotional moments, struck Crowther as calculated copies of Brando's signature gestures. Most damning of all, James's emotional intensity felt to Crowther like a studied imitation of Brando's method acting techniques rather than genuine feeling. What Crowther couldn't see, what no critic could see, was the psychological reality behind James's performance. The mannerisms that Crowther dismissed as Brando imitation were actually the authentic expressions of James's unresolved trauma. The mumbled speech wasn't copying Brando's style. It was the way James actually spoke when overwhelmed by emotion. A speech pattern developed in childhood as a defense against his mother's death. The physical gestures weren't calculated mimicry. They were the unconscious body language of someone who had never learned healthy ways to express psychological pain. Crowther spent the night after the screening, crafting his review with the precision of a surgeon performing an amputation. He knew his words would be read by industry executives, fellow critics, and moviegoers across the country. He also knew that a harsh review from him could damage or even destroy a young actor's career. But Crowther believed he was performing a service to cinema by calling out what he saw as fraudulent artistry. "Rebel without a cause," Crowther wrote, "is violent, brutal, and disturbing. Yet, it is also a curiously unmoving film." The fault lies largely with James Dean, whose performance amounts to a clumsy display of histrionic effects. Never have we seen a performer so clearly follow another's style. These forgotten stories deserve to be told. If you think so too, subscribe and like this video. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. Mr. Dean appears to be doing a studied imitation of Marlon Brando, from the underplayed speech to the marginally controlled movements. The comparison is not flattering to the young actor. Crowther continued his assault with surgical precision. Where Mr. Brando achieves authenticity through his commitment to truth, Mr. Dean achieves only artifice through his commitment to mannerisms. The result is a performance that calls attention to itself rather than to the character, leaving the audience aware they are watching an actor rather than experiencing a story. The review was devastating not just for its harshness, but for its accuracy in identifying James's deepest insecurity. Ever since arriving in Hollywood, James had struggled with comparisons to Brando. He admired the older actor intensely, studied his performances obsessively, and was simultaneously inspired and intimidated by Brando's revolutionary approach to acting. But what James experienced as influence and inspiration, Crowther perceived as imitation and theft. The morning of October 27, 1955, James Dean woke up in his Sherman Oaks rental house and followed his usual routine. He made coffee, fed his cat Marcus, and walked outside to retrieve his newspapers from the driveway. The Los Angeles Times carried a syndicated version of Crowther's review on page 3 of the entertainment section. James saw his name in the headline and began reading with the eager anticipation that every young actor feels when opening reviews of their latest work. The first paragraph hit him like a physical blow. By the second paragraph, James was sitting heavily on his front steps, the newspaper shaking in his hands. By the time he finished reading Crowther's complete demolition of his performance, James Dean was crying openly in his front yard, overwhelmed by a humiliation so complete that it triggered every abandonment trauma he had carried since childhood. For James, Crowther's review wasn't just professional criticism, it was personal annihilation. The words "studied imitation" and "clumsy display" confirmed his deepest fear about himself. That he was a fraud, that his talent was artificial, that he would always be a poor copy of someone better. More devastatingly, the review's national prominence meant that everyone in Hollywood, everyone in America, would now see him the way Crowther did. As a pretender, a fake. A young man with no authentic identity of his own. James called his agent, Dick Clayton, from his kitchen phone, his voice barely controlled. "Have you seen the Times review?" he asked. "James, listen to me," Clayton said carefully. "One critic doesn't define your career. There will be other reviews, other opportunities." "He called me a fraud," James interrupted, his voice breaking. "He said I'm nothing but a Brando imitation. What if he's right? What if that's all I am? Clayton tried to reassure his young client, but he could hear something in James's voice that worried him. A desperation that went far beyond normal professional disappointment. James wasn't just hurt by the review. He was psychologically shattered by it. The criticism had triggered something deep and damaged in James's psyche, something that Clayton recognized but couldn't address. James spent the morning calling friends and colleagues, desperate for reassurance that Crowther was wrong. But with each conversation, James heard something different in people's voices. A hesitation, an uncertainty that suggested maybe Crowther had articulated what others had been thinking, but were too polite to say. Had he really been copying Brando all along? Was his entire identity as an actor built on mimicry rather than authentic talent? By afternoon, James's desperation had transformed into something more dangerous. He began drinking heavily, not socially but compulsively, using alcohol to numb the psychological pain that Crowther's words had reopened. Friends who spoke to him later that day described a young man in complete emotional freefall, convinced that his career was over and his artistic identity was a lie. What made the situation particularly tragic was that James's response to Crowther's criticism revealed exactly the psychological patterns that had made his acting so powerful in the first place. His inability to separate professional criticism from personal rejection, his tendency to catastrophize setbacks, his desperate need for external validation. These were the same emotional wounds that had allowed him to access such raw authenticity in his performances. Crowther was criticizing James for the very vulnerability that made him a compelling actor. That evening, James drove aimlessly through Los Angeles, ending up at Griffith Observatory, where he had filmed some of his most important scenes for Rebel Without a Cause. If you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support means everything to us. Standing alone in the parking lot where just weeks earlier he had performed the emotional climax of his character's journey, James felt the full weight of what Crowther's review meant for his future. The irony was crushing. Rebel Without a Cause was meant to be James's breakthrough performance, the role that would establish him as more than just the intense young man from East of Eden. Instead, Crowther's review positioned it as evidence that James was a one-dimensional performer, capable only of imitating other actors. The movie that was supposed to prove his range had apparently proven his limitations instead. James called Natalie Wood from a payphone outside the observatory. Natalie, who had experienced her own difficult relationship with James during filming but still cared about his well-being, was shocked by the broken quality of his voice. "He's right," James told her. "Crowther's right. I don't know who I am as an actor. I don't know who I am as a person. Everything I do is just copying someone else, because I don't have anything real inside me to draw from." Natalie tried to reason with him, reminding James of the powerful moments she had witnessed during their work together, the times when his emotional truth had been undeniable. But James couldn't hear her reassurances through the noise of his self-doubt and psychological pain. The conversation that would haunt Natalie for decades revealed the depth of James's identity crisis. He wasn't just upset about a bad review, he was questioning the fundamental authenticity of his existence. Crowther's criticism had struck at the core of James's psychological wounds, his fear that he was fundamentally empty, that without his mother's love, he had never developed a real self, that everything he presented to the world was performance rather than genuine identity. "Maybe I should just quit," James said to Natalie. "Maybe I should go back to Indiana and work on my uncle's farm. At least that would be honest. At least I wouldn't be pretending to be something I'm not." The next morning brought more devastating news. Variety had picked up Crowther's review and expanded on its themes, with their critic writing. Dean's performance in Rebel raises questions about whether his East of Eden success was a fluke. The young actor seems determined to out-Brando, but lacks the older actor's natural charisma and psychological depth. The Hollywood Reporter was even harsher. James Dean appears to be a young man in search of an identity, settling for mimicry when he can't find authenticity. Rebel Without a Cause suffers from Dean's inability to create a character rather than an imitation. By the afternoon of October 28th, every major entertainment publication in the country had weighed in on James's performance, and the consensus was brutally clear. James Dean was a talented mimic, not an original artist. The young man who had dreamed of revolutionizing American cinema was being systematically dismissed as a second-rate copy of someone else's revolution. James's response to this professional disaster was to retreat into the same psychological patterns that had defined his entire life. Just as he had done when his mother died, when his father abandoned him, when Pier Angeli rejected him, James interpreted professional criticism as personal abandonment. In his traumatized mind, Crowther's review wasn't just an aesthetic judgment. It was confirmation that he was unworthy of love, incapable of authenticity, doomed to disappointment. The final week of October 1955 was marked by James's increasingly erratic and self-destructive behavior. He began taking dangerous risks with his cars, driving at excessive speeds on winding mountain roads, as if testing whether the universe would remove him from a world where he couldn't find acceptance. Friends who saw him during this period described a young man who seemed to be actively courting death. On September 30th, 1955, just 3 days after Crowther's review was published, James Dean climbed into his Porsche 550 Spyder for what would be his final drive. Those who knew him best believed that his death was not an accident in the traditional sense, but rather the culmination of a week-long psychological breakdown triggered by his inability to survive professional rejection. The tragedy of Crowther's review is not that it was unfairly harsh, but that it was partially accurate in ways that James couldn't psychologically handle. James had indeed studied Brando intensively, had consciously adopted some of his techniques and mannerisms. But what Crowther saw as calculated mimicry was actually a young man's desperate attempt to learn how to be human from someone who seemed to have mastered authentic emotion. James's imitation of Brando was really his attempt to compensate for the emotional education he had missed when his mother died. He studied Brando the way other people study their parents, trying to learn from someone who seemed to possess the emotional vocabulary that James felt he lacked. The mannerisms Crowther criticized were James's attempts to develop an adult identity from the fragmentary materials available to him. What makes Crowther's review particularly tragic is that it was published just as James was beginning to develop his own artistic voice. The raw power of his performance in Rebel Without a Cause, despite its derivative elements, suggested an actor on the verge of major breakthrough. Given time and experience, James might have evolved beyond his influences to become the original artist he desperately wanted to be. Instead, Crowther's words convinced James that he was already a failure, that his entire approach to acting was fundamentally flawed, that he would never be anything more than a pale imitation of Brando's revolutionary talent. For a young man whose psychological wounds made him incapable of tolerating rejection, this professional judgment became a death sentence. In later years, as James Dean's legend grew and his performances were reevaluated, many critics acknowledged that Crowther's review had been overly harsh and psychologically destructive. Brando himself, when asked about the comparisons, said, James Dean was finding his own way. He didn't need to copy me. He had something entirely his own that he was just beginning to discover. But these reassessments came too late for James Dean. He died believing that he was a fraud, that his talent was artificial, that his entire identity as an artist was built on theft rather than authentic expression. Crowther's review, intended as aesthetic criticism, became the final confirmation of every fear James carried about his own worth and authenticity. The morning after James's death, Bosley Crowther learned about the young actor's fatal accident from a colleague at the New York Times. The critic felt genuine shock and sadness at the news, but he also felt something else, a nagging worry that his harsh review might have contributed to James's final psychological state. In his private papers, discovered decades after his own death, Crowther wrote, "The death of James Dean has forced me to consider the responsibility of criticism. While I stand by my aesthetic judgments, I wonder if my words might have wounded a young man more deeply than I intended. Perhaps there was something authentic in his performance that I failed to recognize. Something original emerging from beneath the surface of imitation." The tragedy extends beyond James's death to the artistic development that was lost. James Dean died just as he was beginning to understand how to transform his psychological wounds into authentic artistry rather than unconscious mimicry. His final performance in Giant, filmed after Crowther's review but before his death, showed signs of an actor beginning to find his own voice, developing the confidence to trust his instincts rather than copy his influences. The story of Crowther's review and James's response reveals something crucial about the relationship between criticism and artistic development. While harsh but accurate criticism can sometimes help artists grow and improve, it can also be devastating to performers whose psychological wounds make them incapable of distinguishing between professional judgment and personal rejection. James Dean's inability to survive Crowther's criticism wasn't a sign of artistic weakness. It was a symptom of the same emotional vulnerability that made his performances so compelling. His raw sensitivity, his desperate need for validation, his inability to protect himself from psychological pain. These were the sources of his acting power. But they were also the reasons he couldn't survive in an industry built on constant judgment and rejection. In the end, Bosley Crowther's review of Rebel Without a Cause became one of the most influential pieces of film criticism ever written. Not because of its aesthetic insights, but because of its psychological impact. It stands as a reminder that critics wield enormous power over the artists they evaluate, and that words intended as professional assessment can become personal devastation for performers whose emotional wounds make them incapable of separating art from identity. James Dean died believing he was a failure, a fraud, a young man whose entire artistic identity was built on imitation rather than authentic expression. The boy who had lost his mother at 9, who had spent his entire life searching for approval and acceptance, could not survive being told that even his greatest talent was nothing more than borrowed greatness from someone else. The cruel irony is that time proved Crowther wrong. James Dean's performances, viewed decades later, reveal an artist of extraordinary authenticity and emotional power. His alleged imitation of Brando appears now as the natural influence that all artists experience when learning their craft. His supposed mannerisms read now as the genuine expressions of a uniquely sensitive and damaged young man, struggling to transform his pain into art. But James Dean never lived to see this vindication. He died on a highway in California, driving too fast, taking too many risks, convinced that he was nothing more than a pale copy of someone better. Bosley Crowther's words had become his epitaph. Never have we seen a performer so clearly follow another's style. It was meant as aesthetic judgment. It became a young man's final self-perception, and ultimately, his death sentence. James Dean lived only 24 years, but those years were filled with stories the world never heard. Stories of love, pain, rebellion, dreams that died too soon. This channel exists to tell those stories, to remember not just the icon, but the man. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe, because James Dean's story isn't over. Not yet.